This part of the gallery is entitled Lasting Legacy, and here we look at the question, what does this migration matter to us today? When we look at the migration, about 8,000, just under 8,000 Mennonites left in 1922. Today, the descendants of that group have become 300,000 Mennonites scattered throughout North, South, and Central America. So the beginning of this migration is really the beginning of a huge scattering of this population in this part of the world. What was it like in Canada when this group left? That's one of the questions that historians will find difficult to answer because it's a what-if question. We never really know what happens when one thing happens, what could have happened. But we can say that in Canada, Mennonite communities in Canada did become more assimilated. It could be because this one group, this more traditionalist group, left to Latin America. It was also influenced by the fact that a more progressive, assimilation-minded group came from the Soviet Union right at the same time. But whatever the cause, this migration sort of hurried that process on. We saw Mennonite street villages failing around this time or shortly before. We saw an increased activity of Mennonites serving in the military, for example, in the Second World War compared to the First. All of these are questions that we ask of history when we look at this. Did this migration have any effect in those kinds of areas? For the group itself, it led to this migration from Canada to Mexico, and 4 years later to Paraguay, also led to this kind of splintering off into the rest of Latin America. And so starting from the 1950s, we have secondary migrations leaving Mexico specifically. We have Mennonites settling in areas like British Honduras, which is today Belize, and Bolivia, other areas of Paraguay, even places like Argentina. And so we have this scattering of this group throughout this part of the world. And that all began from this emigration from Canada in 1922. In Canada, we also see the effects of this in the people who have returned from Latin America to resettle in Canada. In the early years, when Mennonites returned from Mexico in the 1920s, they tended to return to the homes that they had left behind, or at least the villages and places that they had left behind. But starting in the 1950s, Mennonites began to migrate to southern Ontario, from Mexico to southern Ontario, for economic reasons mainly, to work as seasonal farm laborers in agriculture there. As they would work there in the summers, they would return to Mexico for the winters and do this repeatedly year after year until eventually a few started staying in southern Ontario. So starting in the 1950s, a sizable community started to form in southern Ontario. Today in southern Ontario, we have about 40,000 old colonists living in that part of the country where that kind of a community hadn't existed before. We also have Mennonites who are returning to Canada seeking homes in more isolated and remote areas of the country, for example, northern Alberta in places like Tabor or Two Hills. And so as we see this scattering of the population in Latin America, we also see some of that happening in Canada as well, pulling the traditionalist Mennonite worldview and way of life into different parts of the world where it hadn't existed before.